Hello, everyone. Welcome to Or This. This is my Monday morning quarterbacking of the scriptures and the sermon from the previous Sunday, and this video is from Sunday, September 3rd. The scriptures that were assigned for the day were Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, Psalm 105, verses 1 through 6, 23 to 26, and verse 45b, Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 21, and Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. So, I preached on the gospel from Matthew, but we continue with these semi-continuous readings, which at the beginning of summer started with Genesis, and then when we finished Genesis, we moved on to Exodus. And so even as I go back to preaching on the gospel reading, I'm still kind of torn and interested in what's going on in the Exodus passages as well. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about here in this video. And the passage from Exodus is the story of God calling Moses, because God hears the cries of God's people who are being oppressed and enslaved by the Egyptians, and God wants to deliver them from slavery into freedom. And God decides to call Moses for this task. In this story, this might be a story you've heard before. Moses' call comes as Moses is out in the wilderness tending his father-in-law's sheep when he sees a bush that is burning but is not being consumed by the fire. And out of that bush comes God's voice, speaking to him and calling him to this task. What I wanted to talk about in this particular passage is the way that God is identified. First of all, when there is first this voice that comes calling for Moses, and Moses says, "Here I am." First, God tells him to remove his sandals because he is on holy ground. And then God says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Now remember, I've said this in my sermons when we were going through the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that at different points in the scriptures, this is how God is going to be identified. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And by doing this helps Moses and anybody else who's reading it to know who we're talking about and to know something about this God. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God who keeps promises, because God's people have, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have become a great many people, a great multitude of people. So many so that's why the Egyptians are enslaving them, because they were afraid it was such a big group that if they went and joined Egypt's enemies, they could overpower them, which was not something that should have happened. The Egyptian pharaoh seemed to be a little bit paranoid about the situation. But what it did show is that God fulfilled God's promise to Abraham to make him the father of many, and that his descendants would be a great multitude. So already, God identifies who God is to Moses, and Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. Later on in the conversation, after Moses is told by God what God wants him to do, Moses says, if the Israelites ask who sent Moses to free them, what is Moses supposed to say? How is Moses supposed to answer? Well, what is this God's name? And God responds, "I am who I am." At least that's how it's translated in our text, which is New Revised Standard Version. But those who know their Hebrew very well, I don't know it very well. I go by the commentaries that give us some background on the Hebrew. but they say that a better translation of that phrase would be, I will be whom I will be. And it's kind of an interesting way for God to try to express a name. It's obviously using the verb to be, which is not a name in our minds, right? But at the same time, I think what it says is you will know God by who God is, what God does, more so than from just a name. Of course, later on, God is referred to as the Lord. But at this point, God is, I am who I am, or I will be whom I will be. And I think this helps us to think about God through the things that God does. First and foremost, God's people are going to get to know I will be whom I will be through being delivered from slavery. So the God who freed us from slavery. So we have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who fulfilled the promise to Abraham to make him a father of many, many people, many nations. And then we have the God who delivers God's people from slavery into freedom. And then, of course, we're going to continue to get these stories in Exodus and hear about their deliverance from slavery into freedom. We're going to hear about, I think we're going to get into the story about them wandering in the wilderness and the things that God provides. That God is the one who provides food. God is the one who provides water. When they get to the Red Sea and they are hemmed in between the sea and Pharaoh's army who was pursuing them, God delivers them again from their enemies. And so God will become God as the deliverer. And so God really is more focused on identifying who God is through what God does for humanity. Because really that's the most important aspect of the relationship, is how God provides provides for humanity what humanity can't provide for ourselves. And so this helps us then to think about God as a God of doing, a God of action, rather than thinking of God as kind of just a being. But God is an active God that remains in relationship with and interacting with humanity in various ways in the world. So I will be whom I will be tells us that we will know God through what God does. And the God who keeps promises, the God who delivers from slavery into freedom, the God who delivers from our enemies, the God who provides everything that we need to sustain life, the God who accompanies us when we wander in wilderness moments, the God who teaches us to rely upon God for our lives. There are certainly a lot of, truthfully, there are certainly a lot of names that we have for God, but all of those names are based off of what God does, what God has done, what God continues to do in our life and in our world. So I encourage you to think about the names of God that you use regularly and why you use those names. What does it tell you about what God does and who God is? And most of the time, the names of God have to do with what God has done, or what God continues to do. Because God's identity is one who does, one who acts, one who is moved, not one who sits by and just watches, but is moved by our lives, is moved by what happens in our world. A moving God. I am who I am. I will be whom I will be. So watch and see what I do. Watch and see what I'm up to. That's what I think about. Keep an eye out for what God is up to, what God will be doing around us. So those are some thoughts for this week. I'd be interested to hear any thoughts you might have on the sermon, scriptures, or this video. And please submit those in the comments. Thanks for watching. God bless.